June 1940. Valence. The morning sun rose like a quiet confession over the fields of Saint-Malo. The air was still, almost painfully so, as if the world held its breath. A thin veil of fog clung to the wheat and to the sea beyond, softening the edges of a country that was about to break. Elise Moreau stood in the doorway of the village hospital, her hands still stained faintly with iodine. The night had been long stretchers, whispers, the smell of blood and iron, and yet, in this dawn, the town seemed untouched. She could almost pretend the radio hadn't spoken those dreadful words, "Paris has fallen." She had always imagined war as something distant, something written about in old history books, heroes on horses, battles fought far from home. But now it had arrived on the wind that carried German boots and smoke from the north. Behind her, Sister Colette prayed in Latin, her trembling voice rising and falling. The other nurses, barely older than Elise's 23 years, folded bandages with mechanical precision. They had all learned to move silently, to keep their fears somewhere deep inside, away from the eyes of the wounded. "Drink something, Monsieur Tree," Sister Colette said gently. "You'll need strength." Elise nodded, though her stomach had forgotten hunger. Strength meant more than food. It meant listening without breaking when a young soldier begged for his mother. It meant closing his eyes when he no longer breathed. Outside, a cart rattled down the cobblestone street. The baker's boy, Luke, waved shyly, carrying loaves for the soldiers. His mother had sewn a tiny tricolor ribbon into his sleeve, hope hidden in thread. Elise caught sight of it and pressed her lips together. Even a child understood the need for secrecy now. The world changed quietly, one whisper at a time. By noon, the first convoy entered the town. Engines rumbled like thunder beneath the church bells. Children stopped playing marbles in the alley. The smell of diesel and leather filled the streets as grey uniforms flooded through the narrow lanes. Elise watched from the hospital window as the German column marched in, their helmets gleaming beneath the sunlight, their eyes unreadable. One officer barked orders. His voice was crisp, confident, too certain for a man who had crossed into another's home. Behind him, a soldier with fair hair carried a wounded comrade on his shoulders. Elise blinked for a moment, their eyes met. His were not cruel, but tired and haunted even before the true war had begun. Hans Adler. She did not know his name yet, but fate had already chosen their intersection. The French flag came down from the mairie that afternoon. No one clapped. No one cried. The silence was more violent than any explosion. That night, Elise walked through the courtyard, the scent of burning paper in the air. German soldiers had lit fires to destroy documents, books, anything bearing the tricolor emblem. She saw one sheet float upward, a part of a child's school essay, edges curling in flame. In the distance, the sea murmured against the rocks like a secret prayer. The occupation unfolded not in battles but in gestures. Some villagers nodded too eagerly when German boots passed. Others turned away and whispered "traitor" under their breath. Elise kept her eyes down, her heart quiet. Every choice was dangerous, too kind, and you were suspected of sympathy, too cold, and you were accused of rebellion. At the hospital, she treated whoever came. Uniforms meant nothing once the blood flowed. French, British, German, she cleaned the wounds all the same. But each bandage carried guilt. Once, while sewing a gash in a German soldier's leg, she felt him flinch and mutter, "Dank." The sound of gratitude from an enemy startled her. When she looked up, his gaze held something fragile like a mirror she didn't want to look into. That night, she wrote in her hidden notebook, "They bleed as we do, yet they march behind the symbol that kills us." Her brother Ander would have laughed at her for such thoughts. He had joined the resistance in Paris months ago, sending her letters through coded courier routes. His last message ended with a phrase that made her both proud and afraid. "If I disappear, done to look for me continue the work. She kept the letter under her pillow. By the end of that summer, whispers traveled faster than the wind. At the bakery, people spoke in half sentences. At the church, confessions turned into secret meetings. The schoolteacher, Monsieur Lenoir, began hiding pamphlets in children's textbooks. And in the attic of the bakery, a young British radio operator named Daniel Whittaker tapped out signals to London under the smell of rising bread. Elise learned of him through Sister Colette, who tended to the baker's wife. "He is brave," the nun had whispered one evening, "but foolish. If the Gestapo finds his transmitter, the whole street will burn." Curiosity and conscience led Elise that night. The attic was dim, filled with the hum of wires and the faint click of Morse code. Daniel looked up, startled, when she entered, a face too young to have seen so much war. His French was broken but sincere. "You are nurse?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied cautiously. "And you are making a very loud mistake." He smiled faintly. "Then you can tell me how to make it quieter." That smile would haunt her later, the kind of smile people wore before history swallowed them. Hans Adler watched the occupation unfold from his assigned post near the church. He was 26, from Hamburg, once a student of philosophy. His father had fought in the Great War and lost everything but bitterness. When Hans enlisted, he believed he was serving honor, not ideology. Now, as he stood beneath the crucifix of a foreign chapel, he wondered what honor meant. His superior, Captain Vogler, was a man of cold obedience. "Mercy breeds disloyalty," Vogler often said. "We are the hand of order." But Hans saw too many hands trembling when they raised their rifles. One evening he entered the hospital to deliver supplies. He found Elise tending to a feverish child. Her voice was gentle, her movements precise. For a moment the war receded. He wanted to speak, but silence felt safer. When he left, he paused by the door and whispered in German, too softly for her to hear. "Not all enemies are enemies." The first frost came early. With it came new orders, the identification and deportation of Jewish families. Posters appeared overnight. Elise tore one down outside the bakery, her hand shaking. Daniel saw her from the attic window and climbed down quietly. "You mustn't," he said. "They shoot for less. They retaking children," she hissed. "Do you expect me to watch?" He looked at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "No, but you will need help." That night the resistance of Saint-Malo began not with guns, but with a whisper between a nurse and a stranger. They forged papers, smuggled infants into the convent, and carried information on scraps of bread paper. Every heartbeat became a gamble. Once, during a storm, Elise and Daniel carried a hidden child through the sewers beneath the town. The water was cold, the air suffocating. When they emerged into the night, the church bells were ringing not for mass, but as a coded warning. The Gestapo were near. They ran until dawn. By early 1941, Saint-Malo looked unchanged on the surface. The market still opened. Children still played. The sea still glimmered. But under every smile was fear. The leaves grew thinner. Sleep became a rumor. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, she heard the clicking of Daniel's radio from across the street and felt her pulse synchronize with its dot dash, like two hearts beating across the dark. Hans began noticing small inconsistencies in the patrol logs, missing supplies, altered documents, forged signatures. He didn't report them. Perhaps he didn't want to. Captain Vogler did. The first arrest came in February. Monsieur Lenoir, the schoolteacher. They dragged him from his home at dawn, accusing him of hiding pamphlets. The next morning, his wife found his spectacles broken on the church steps. Elise tended to her, knowing too well what grief looked like when it pretended to breathe. Later that week, she found a note slipped beneath the hospital door. They are coming for the children. Midnight. Move them now. It was unsigned, but she knew the handwriting. Hans Adler. The raid came sooner than expected. German trucks rolled through the streets, headlights off. The convent bells clanged once, then fell silent. Elise and Sister Colette rushed through the dormitory, shaking the sleeping children awake. Daniel waited by the back gate with a cot covered in hay. The smallest girl, Miriam, clung to Elise's skirt. "Will they take us?" she whispered. "No," Elise said, though she no longer knew the meaning of truth. "Not tonight." They loaded the children into the cart. The wheels groaned against the cobblestones. Elise held her breath with each turn, each shadow. From the corner of her eye, she saw Hans standing by the gate, torch in hand. He caught her gaze and slowly, deliberately turned away, signaling the guards to the opposite street. For one impossible heartbeat, the war paused. The cart vanished into the fog. Anneliese, standing in the cold light of betrayal and mercy entwined, understood what kind of war she was truly fighting. Not for nations, not for victory, but for the quiet right to remain human. The war no longer arrived in waves. It had settled like dust in the lungs, something people breathed without noticing. By the spring of 1941, Saint-Malo had learned to look normal. The market opened each morning beneath the shadow of the German flag. The fishermen still mended their nets by the pier. Church bells still rang, though the sound now seemed thinner, as if afraid to echo. And in the white stone hospital on Rue des Carmes, Elise Moreau still walked the same corridor she had since her apprenticeship, though every footstep now carried the weight of invisible choices. She wore her nurse's uniform like armor. Its crisp folds, the blue cross on her sleeve, the scent of carbolic soap, these were her weapons against despair. When she entered a room, patients straightened, the wounded ceased moaning. There was comfort in her quiet efficiency, though she herself no longer slept. The hospital had come under German supervision. A plaque with the eagle and swastika hung above the entrance, its black wings spread wide. The new military overseer was Captain Vogler, the same man Hans served under. He was meticulous, his accent sharp as glass. Discipline, he told the staff on his first day, is the highest mercy in war. Elise kept her expression neutral. Vogler's eyes lingered too long on everyone's face, as if he could read disloyalty in pause. Hans stood a few paces behind him, clipboard in hand. He looked different in daylight, calmer, the lines around his eyes deeper. When Elise caught his gaze, he offered the smallest nod, barely perceptible. A fragile truce passed between them, gratitude, fear, and a question near the dead voice. After the inspection, Vogler ordered all medical reports to be written in German. Sister Colette, who spoke little beyond prayer, muttered a Genoese guard and crossed herself. That night, Elise worked the children's ward. Tiny shapes lay beneath threadbare blankets, the smell of antiseptic mixing with candle wax. Outside, rain beat softly against the shutters. One boy, barely 8, stirred in his sleep, whispering his mother's name. She knelt beside him, adjusting the bandage on his arm. He had been caught in a bombing near Rennes. No one knew if his parents had survived. She whispered a lullaby her own mother once sang, Dors, petit ange, le vent s'éteint. Sleep, little angel, the wind is quiet. When she rose, Hans was standing in the doorway. He had removed his cap, rain darkened his hair. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said softly in French. "You shouldn't be here," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I brought medicine," he said, holding up a small crate. "From our stores, it won't be recorded." Elise hesitated. Accepting help from a German was treason in all but name. Yet when she looked at the boy's pale face, choice dissolved. She took the crate silently. Hans nodded once and left without another word. Every few weeks, Elise wrote to her brother Ander, knowing the letters might never cross the occupied lines. The town still stands, she wrote, but something in us crumbles daily. I have met people who should be enemies yet remind me of home. Perhaps war breaks rules before it breaks hearts. She sealed the letter and gave it to Father Bonneau, who smuggled correspondence through the resistance network hidden in crane deliveries. Each note was a risk, each word a weapon or a wound. Sometimes she dreamed of Anders standing on a Paris rooftop, sending his own coded messages to London. She wondered if he ever thought of her beneath the same moon. Across the square, Daniel Whittaker's attic had become the quiet pulse of Saint-Malo's rebellion. By day, the bakery sold breads stamped with German ration seals. By night, Daniel and 2 French couriers tapped messages through his battered transmitter, hidden beneath flour sacks. Elise often slipped in under the pretext of checking on Madame Roux, the baker's sick wife. In reality, she carried information troop movement she overheard at the hospital, whispers from passing soldiers, supply schedules. Daniel listened intently, eyes flickering with exhaustion and admiration. "You're braver than half the soldiers I've met," he told her once. She smiled thinly. "No, I am just more afraid of doing nothing." When he laughed, it sounded strange in that Attica sound that didn't belong in war. It happened in May. At dusk, distant engines roared, a patrol returning earlier than expected. Daniel's fingers froze mid-code. Elise, who had been helping transcribe coordinates, felt her stomach twist. "Gestapo," Daniel whispered. "They researching houses street by street." The attic had no proper exit, only the bakery staircase below and a tiny skylight above. They could already hear boots. "Go," Daniel urged. "You can still get out through the back." Elise shook her head. "They'll question me if I am seen leaving." He shoved the radio beneath the flour sacks. "Then pray they like bread." The door downstairs burst open. Harsh German voices filled the air. Elise's pulse hammered. She grabbed a mixing bowl and pretended to knead dough, hands trembling. Hans entered first. Her breath caught. He looked from her to the sacks, then back. His jaw tightened, recognition flashed. "Fr. Elise Moreau," he said evenly. "You should not be here after curfew. I was helping Madame Roux. She is ill." Behind him, Vogler sniffed disdainfully. "Search everything." Hans hesitated half a heartbeat before replying. "No need, only flour here. We checked the back already." Vogler glared, but after a tense pause, motioned his men out. When they were gone, Hans lingered a second longer, then said quietly in German, "Go home, now." Elise nodded, heart pounding. That night she burned her apron and washed her hands 3 times, but the scent of flour and fear remained. Sister Colette noticed the change. "You've been walking in shadows," she said one morning, while lighting candles before Mass. "Whatever you carry, child, make sure it is for the light." Elise bit her lip. "If I told you, sister, you'd have to lie for me." Colette smiled sadly. "Then I shall lie twice, if that keeps one soul alive." They prayed together in silence. Outside, the gulls screamed over the harbour, as if mocking human sorrow. Hans returned to barracks that night and found Vogler at his desk, writing reports. "You hesitated today," the captain said without looking up. Hans straightened. "Only for accuracy, sir." The bakery was clear. Vogler's pen stopped. "You are a good soldier, Adler. Do not forget what that means. Sentiment is the root of decay." Hans saluted, but when he left the room, he felt a crack widening inside. He walked to the pier, the night cold and soul-bitten. Somewhere across the channel, London burned. He wondered if there was a place left where a man could breathe without orders. He took from his pocket a photograph of his sister, Lot, smiling beneath an apple tree. She would have been Elise's age. He hadn't heard from her in months. War made ghosts of the living long before they died. Weeks passed. The resistance grew bolder. Sabotage in the rail yard, coated graffiti, stolen documents. Each success felt like a heartbeat, each loss like a lung collapsing. Elise and Daniel met rarely now, only when messages were too urgent for radio. Their words were quick, their silences longer. London says the Allies are preparing something big, Daniel told her one evening. Maybe months, maybe a year, just hold on. She wanted to believe him, but holding on was its own battle. As they parted, she pressed a small St. Christopher medal into his palm. For luck, she said. He looked at her hand a moment too long. I'll bring it back when this is over. Neither said the truth that in war few things ever returned. One morning in late August, a truckload of prisoners arrived, farmers, teachers, even the baker's son, Luke. Vogler announced they were caught aiding the resistance. The hospital courtyard filled with silence as they were marched away. Elise stood frozen by the window, her nails digging into her palms. Hans passed by, his face pale. He said nothing, but his eyes met hers, an apology he could never voice. That night, gunfire echoed from the cliffs beyond the town. Elise didn't cry. She simply sat by the boy's empty bed until dawn and whispered, "I am sorry." The attic above the bakery had become more than a hiding place. It was a heartbeat, a fragile rhythm pulsing beneath Saint-Malo's silence, sending invisible sparks across the channel to a London Elise could only imagine. The walls smelled of yeast and dust. Cracks in the ceiling let thin threads of daylight fall upon the small transmitter Daniel kept hidden beneath the torn blanket. Wires coiled like veins across the floor, connecting the machine to an antenna disguised as a laundry line outside the window. At night, when the streets slept under curfew, Daniel's fingers danced over the telegraph key, sharp, steady clicks that echoed through the boards like a second pulse. Dot dot dash dot the dash dash dot. To anyone listening from the street, it was nothing. But to the resistance and the Allied command in London, those clicks were life itself. It had taken Elise weeks to learn the rhythm of the radio. She sat across from Daniel, copying his translations, her handwriting trembling each time he whispered a code name or coordinate. "A London says supply drops coming near dinner," he murmured one evening, his voice barely above breath. "We have to confirm landing zone." Elise looked over the message, brow furrowed. "But that's too close to the German patrol road." He gave a tired smile. "Welcome to war, Nurse Moreau. Nothing is ever far enough." She leaned closer, her candle flickering. "And if they find this place?" "Then they'll find ghosts," he said, eyes still on the machine. "Because by the time they climb those stairs, we'll already be stories." There was something both reckless and holy about the way he said it, like he'd already accepted death as part of his uniform. By day, Elise returned to her duties at the hospital. Children with frostbitten feet, farmers with infected cuts, soldiers with eyes that no longer saw. She spoke to them softly, her hands steady, her mind elsewhere on the attic, the codes, the small hum of resistance breathing behind her everyday words. Hands appeared occasionally with medical supplies. Each time, their eyes met like strangers who shared a dangerous secret. One morning, he lingered by the door longer than usual. "I hear the town baker's wife is improving," he said in French. Elise froze mid-movement. He knew. Or at least, he was saying that he knew. "Yes," she replied evenly. "She is very grateful for the medicine." Hans' gaze softened. "Gratitude is rare in times like these, don't you lose it." Then he turned and left, leaving her heart pounding with both suspicion and relief. That night, rain lashed against the attic roof. Daniel hunched over his transmitter, headphones pressed to his ears, brow furrowed. "What is it?" Elise asked, wiping rain from her coat. He didn't answer at first. Then slowly he lifted his head. It's a new code group. They want confirmation of Operation Lantern. She frowned. Lantern? I don't know yet, but it's urgent. They repeated it twice. They worked for hours, decoding fragments, troop movements near Normandy, and instruction for regional cells to prepare for something larger. When Daniel finally sat back, exhaustion etched deep lines into his face. It's beginning, he said quietly. The war is shifting. Elise stared at the trembling candle flame. And what will happen to us when it does? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. We survive long enough to matter. The next morning, Elise tried to write to Ander again. I don't know if you'll ever read this. We rebuilding something fragile here, hope wrapped in silence. I've met people who remind me that even in war, the heart refuses orders. There is a man who risks everything to send words across the sea, and another who wears the enemy's uniform but carries mercy in his eyes. I think both will die, and I can't decide which will haunt me more. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a hollow behind the chapel altar, where Father Benotti would find it on his next secret errand. In the attic, time blurred. There were hours when they said nothing, just the hum of the transmitter, a crackle of static, the steady drip of rain through the roof. Daniel spoke suddenly one night. When the war ends, what will you do? Elise hesitated. Sleep for a year. He laughed softly. Good choice. I think I'll go back to my village, fix radios for people who only use them for music. Do you believe that's possible? She asked. He met her eyes. Belief is all we've got left. For a moment, the war seemed far away. Their silence felt sacred. Then came the footsteps. Heavy boots. Multiple pairs. Stopping right below the attic. Elise's blood froze. Daniel's hand darted to the transmitter, killing the signal. The only sound left was rain tapping the window. A voice shouted below, German, authoritative. Open, Gestapo inspection. Daniel's face went pale. They've traced the signal. He grabbed the small codebook and a vial of acid kept for emergencies. Without hesitation, he poured the liquid over the pages, the ink curling into smoke. Elise looked toward the tiny skylight. We can both fit. You go, he said quickly. You can pass as a nurse leaving night duty. She shook her head violently. And you? I lost all them. Boots pounded on the stairs. The bakery door crashed open. Elise, go! She climbed onto the counter, pushed open the skylight, and slipped into the cold rain. As she crawled across the roof, she heard the attic door burst open below, shouts, chaos, the crash of furniture. Then silence. She didn't look back. By dawn, Daniel Whittaker was gone. The bakery stood empty, flour scattered like ashes across the floor. Madame Rue sobbed quietly, her husband gone to questioning. No one knew if Daniel had been captured or escaped. Elise felt a numbness deeper than fear. She walked through the hospital corridors that morning in silence, her face calm, her pulse screaming. That evening, a folded note appeared under her door. No name, just words. He is alive. Hidden for now. Tell no one. At the bottom was a single initial, H. Hans. She found him near the harbor that night, standing where the tide met the cobblestones. His uniform looked heavier than ever, like a burden he could no longer wear. You helped him, she said quietly. He nodded once. They were going to take him to Rennes. I told them he'd been shot trying to escape. I moved him to an old watchtower near the cliff. Elise's throat tightened. Why? Hans's eyes drifted toward the horizon. Because there's a difference between serving your country and losing your soul. She wanted to thank him, to curse him, to ask if redemption meant anything in a world like this. But all she said was, if they find out. They will, he interrupted. They always do, but until then, make his messages count. He handed her a small tin box, the spare transmitter crystal. I'll need this. Then he walked away into the fog, leaving footprints the tide soon erased. The attic was quiet now. Elise sat before the silent transmitter, the candle burning low. She touched the key, her fingers trembling. Then, slowly, she began to tap. To London. Operator missing. Message continues. Franz still breathing. She hesitated, then added, "Tell them hope survives." When she finished, she sat in the darkness, the hum of the machine fading into the sound of distant waves. For the first time, she felt truly alone, and yet, somehow, not. The signal had gone. The world had heard. That was enough. The German garrison in Saint-Malo woke before dawn, the sound of boots and orders echoing through the narrow stone corridors of the commandeered town hall. Rain streaked the windows, a cold Atlantic drizzle that painted everything in shades of iron grey. Lieutenant Hans Müller sat alone at a wooden desk, a half-burnt cigarette between his fingers, staring at the papers before him, lists of names, reports of suspected resistance activity, and orders written in a language he once believed was justice. Now it read like guilt. He rubbed his temples. The candlelight flickered, illuminating the silver cross hanging loosely around his neck, a remnant from his mother, back in Hamburg. She had whispered to him the night before he left, "Do not lose your soul in the uniform, Hans." He had promised her he wouldn't. He wasn't sure he had kept that promise. Outside, the sound of a church bell echoed faintly. The city had been quiet since the bakery raid. The Gestapo had taken over the investigation, men who smiled like wolves and believed mercy was weakness. Hans had stood by as they dragged suspects through the streets, their hands bound, their eyes empty. He was a soldier, not a murderer. At least, that's what he told himself. Later that morning, he was ordered to oversee medical supply distribution at the hospital, a routine inspection, though everyone knew it was a cover for surveillance. The commandant suspected the nurses were hiding something. When Hans entered the hospital, the scent of antiseptic and smoke greeted him. The halls were crowded with wounded German soldiers, French civilians, and the faint echo of whispered prayers. And there she was again, Elise Durand, the nurse with the steady eyes and quiet defiance. She was wrapping a bandage around a boy's arm, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair tied back with a white cloth that had long lost its purity. "Lieutenant Keller," she said calmly, meeting his gaze. "We weren't expecting another inspection so soon." Hans nodded stiffly. "Just a formality, Fr. Elise Durand." He walked beside her, clipboard in hand, pretending to check supply crates. She moved with quiet precision, her every motion careful, as if the act of healing could restore a world that had lost its humanity. "Do you believe in this war?" she asked suddenly, voice low. Hans froze. No one ever asked him that. Certainly not a Frenchwoman under occupation. He turned to her, eyes cautious. "It is not my place to believe, my place is to obey." Her gaze didn't waver. "And if obedience destroys what you are?" He looked away. "Then perhaps I was never who I thought." That night, Hans returned to his quarters above the church, the echo of her words gnawing at him. He poured himself a drink of the cheap kind soldiers bartered for cigarettes and stared out the window. Rain washed over the cobblestones, erasing footprints, blurring lines. He wondered how many times he had erased something human in the name of duty. There was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Sergeant Vogel, a Gestapo officer with a grin that never reached his eyes. "We found something interesting," Vogel said, stepping in without invitation. "A coded note near the hospital grounds. Your department was supposed to be monitoring that area." Hans frowned. "A note?" Vogel handed him a crumpled paper, half burned, written in invisible ink, the kind used by Allied agents. We think the resistance has a courier among the medical staff, perhaps that nurse you seem so interested in. Hans felt his pulse quicken. She is loyal to her patients, that's all. Virgil smirked. Loyalty is a dangerous thing, Lieutenant, that tends to shift when hearts get involved. When he left, Hans sat motionless, the paper trembling in his hand. If Elise was part of the resistance, and he suspected she was returning her and would save his career, maybe even his life. But it would also destroy the last piece of decency he had left. 2 days later, he received new orders, assist in interrogations of captured resistance suspects. The thought made him sick, but refusal meant suspicion. He entered the basement of the town hall, where the walls were damp and the light weak. The air reeked of fear. 3 prisoners sat tied to chairs, men who had once been farmers, teachers, brothers. One of them was Monsieur Leblanc, the old baker. Hans recognized him immediately. The man who had smiled at soldiers, offered them bread, who secretly hid radio parts in flour sacks. "Who else works with you?" Virgil asked, coldly pacing. Leblanc said nothing. His lip was bleeding, his breathing shallow. Virgil turned to Hans. "Your turn, Lieutenant, maybe a gentler approach." Hans knelt beside the man. "Please," he said softly in French. "Tell them nothing. It will not save you, but it may save others." Leblanc's eyes widened slightly, understanding the strange mercy in his enemy's voice. "You may not like them," he whispered. "Are you?" Hans stood abruptly. "Enough for today," he said. "He'll die either way. What good is more pain?" Virgil stared at him. "You growing soft, killer." "Maybe I am growing tired," Hans replied. That night, Hans found himself walking toward the hospital again. He didn't know why, perhaps because it was the only place that didn't feel poisoned. Through a side window, he saw Elise reading by candlelight, a child asleep beside her bed. For a moment she looked almost peaceful. He stepped closer and noticed the edge of a folded paper tucked into her apron. A code. The same handwriting as the burned note. She looked up suddenly, startled to see him in the doorway. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "you shouldn't be here." "Nor should you," he replied. "The Gestapo knows about the courier. They're watching." Her face paled, but her eyes stayed fierce. "Then you should arrest me." "I should," he said softly. "But I won't." She studied him. "Why?" Hans hesitated. "Because I've done enough harm to last a lifetime, and because—" He stopped himself. "Because what?" she pressed. "Because I think you're fighting for something I no longer have the courage to." They stood in silence, the candle flickering between them, shadows dancing across their faces. Outside, thunder rumbled over the sea. "Leave the hospital tomorrow," Hans whispered. "Take the back road through the forest. They'll come for you at dawn." She didn't move. "And you, what will you do?" He managed a faint smile. "My duty, I suppose, whatever that means now." At dawn, the Gestapo raided the hospital, but Elise was gone. Only an empty bed and a child's toy remained. Hans stood in the corridor, pretending to search, his expression blank. Inside, his heart pounded with a strange mixture of fear and relief. Later that day, Virgil cornered him. The nurse vanished. "Convenient, isn't it?" Hans shrugged. Perhaps she heard rumors and fled. These people live on fear. Virgil leaned closer. "You know, Keller, one day that soft heart of yours will hang you." "Maybe," Hans said, his voice calm. "But at least it will still be mine." That night, he walked to the edge of the town and looked out over the darkened ocean. In the distance, faint flashes lit the horizon of bombs, battles, or maybe signals of hope. For the first time in years, Hans Keller prayed. Not for victory, but for forgiveness. The forest outside Saint-Malo stretched for miles, the dark cathedral of pines and whispering wind. In the dim dawn light, Elise Duran moved quickly through the undergrowth, her shawl damp with mist. Every sound felt louder than it should: the crack of a twig, the rustle of a bird's wing, all reminders that she was now hunted. Behind her, the town she once called home was gone. The Gestapo had searched the hospital, ransacked the wards, and burned the bakery to the ground. The resistance was scattered. Only Daniel's voice, faint and distant through coded messages, kept her from falling apart. She didn't know where to go, only that she had to survive. By noon, the forest grew quieter. Elise found an abandoned shepherd's hut near a stream, its roof half collapsed and covered in moss. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. There was movement in the shadows. She froze. A small figure darted behind a barrel. Then another. Then a third. "Who's there?" she whispered. 3 children emerged slowly, thin, pale, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt. The oldest, a boy no older than 10, held a stick like a weapon. The youngest clutched a ragged doll. "Please," Elise said softly, lowering her voice. "I am not here to hurt you." The boy didn't move. "You read German?" She shook her head quickly. "No, French. My name is Elise. I was a nurse." The boy's eyes flickered with mistrust. "They said everyone in the town was gone." "Almost everyone," Elise replied gently. "What are your names?" The boy hesitated. "I am Samuel. That is my sister Lee and little Jacob." The girl looked barely 7. The smallest child of Jacob couldn't have been more than 4. "Where are your parents?" Elise asked quietly. Samuel's lips trembled. "Taken. The soldiers came to our house in Rennes. They said we were to be relocated." He swallowed hard. "Mama told us to run. We ran." The silence that followed was heavy. Elise's chest tightened. She knew what relocated meant. That night, Elise lit a small fire inside the hut, careful to hide the smoke. She shared what little food she had: stale bread, a bit of cheese, and wrapped the children in her coat. Lee looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Will the soldiers find us?" Elise brushed a lock of hair from the girl's face. "Not if I can help it." "But you read just one person," Samuel said, his voice shaking. She smiled faintly. "One person can still be enough." Over the next few days, Elise nursed the children back to health. She taught them how to stay quiet when planes flew overhead, how to recognize German patrol boats by their rhythm, how to vanish into the trees at a moment's notice. At night, she wrote short coded notes on scraps of paper, messages meant for Daniel if he was still alive. Children found near the coast. Jewish. Hiding in forest huts. Need passage to safety. She tucked them inside a bottle and left them under a marked stone by the stream, a resistant stead drop. Days turned into weeks. Each morning, Elise listened to the distant hum of war artillery rumbling far away, the dull roar of planes, the crack of distant rifles. But here, in the forest, the world felt frozen. She began to feel like a ghost, alive, yet invisible. Still, there were moments of grace. They found wildflowers and placed them in a tin cup. Jacob laughed when Elise taught him to whistle. And Samuel, cautious but brave, learned to set simple traps for rabbits. For the first time in years, Elise felt something she thought the war had buried: hope. It ended the night she saw the lights. At first, she thought it was lightning and quick flashes in the trees. Then came the sound of boots. Dozens. Voices shouting in German. She grabbed the children. At the back quickly. They fled into the darkness, running barefoot through the mud. Elise carried Jacob in her arms as gunfire echoed in the distance. When they reached the river, Samuel stopped. "The LLCS?" Elise's mind raced. She scanned the bank, then saw it, an old fisherman's boat half sunken in reeds. She pushed it free, her arms trembling, and ushered the children inside. "Hold on," she whispered. They drifted silently down the river, the current pulling them through shadows. The moonlight broke through clouds, glimmering on the water, revealing smoke rising behind them. The hut was gone. Lee began to cry. Elise held her close, whispering, "Don't look back." Hours later, when dawn crept over the horizon, they reached the ruins of a small village. The streets were empty, windows shattered, the church steeple broken in half. War had already passed through here. Elise found shelter in a cellar beneath what used to be a wine shop. It smelled of dust and old wood, but it was dry and hidden. She tended to the children and tried to steady her shaking hands. They were safe for now, but for how long? She needed help. She needed Daniel. At night, she risked climbing to the surface, scanning the horizon for signs of Allied forces. Nothing but distant smoke. Then she heard a faint sound, a coded knock on the cellar door. She froze. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. The signal of the resistance. She opened the door slightly and gasped. It was Daniel Müller. His face was thinner, his eyes weary, but his smile was the same. "You alive," he whispered. "Thank God." Elise nearly collapsed with relief. "I thought they got you." "They almost did," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "The network is broken, but some of us are regrouping near Mont Saint-Michel. We replanning extractions for Jewish families. You coming with us?" "There are children," she said quickly. 3 of them. Daniel's expression hardened not from reluctance, but from understanding the risk. "Then we don't leave without them." 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, Elise and Daniel led the children through the marshes. The path was treacherous and narrow trails between flooded fields, with German patrols on both sides. They reached an abandoned chapel where resistance members were waiting. A truck hidden under camouflage nets would take them toward the coast. But just as they prepared to move, headlights appeared on the road. "Patrol," someone hissed. "Hide the children," Elise whispered. Daniel pulled Samuel and Lee behind a stone wall while Elise shielded Jacob in her arms. The truck's engine roared, too late to run. German soldiers poured out, shouting orders. A flare lit the night in harsh white light. For a heartbeat, Elise thought it was over. Then came a familiar voice, sharp, commanding the Hans Müller. He stepped into the light, pistol drawn, scanning the shadows. His eyes locked on Elise, and in that instant, recognition passed between them like lightning. "Lieutenant," a soldier called. "We found movement behind the wall." Hans raised a hand. "Hold your fire." He walked forward slowly, his expression unreadable. Elise's breath caught, not knowing whether he would save them or condemn them. He stopped a few feet away, his voice low. "You were supposed to leave the hospital. I told you never to return." "I couldn't leave them," she whispered. Hans's eyes moved to the children. "You resheltering Jews?" Elise didn't answer. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers waited for his command. Then Hans spoke, his voice sharp but calm. "Nothing here," he said finally. "Just empty ruins. Move out." The soldiers hesitated. "But, sir—" "That's an order," Hans snapped. They obeyed, retreating toward the road. As the last truck disappeared into the darkness, Hans turned back to Elise. His eyes were filled with something like pain. "You have 1 hour," he said quietly. "After that, I want to be able to protect you." Then he was gone. By dawn, Elise, Daniel, and the children reached the resistance safe house near Mont Saint-Michel, a farmhouse hidden among apple orchards. The sea shimmered in the distance, a promise of escape. Elise stood on the cliffs, watching the tide roll in, her heart pounding. Behind her, The children laughed softly, Dana repairing the radio antenna. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. But she knew it wasn't over. The war still raged. And somewhere back in Saint-Malo, a German officer had risked everything to let her alive.